March 29th, 1995. Somerville, Massachusetts. 17-year-old Deanna Cremin spends the evening with her boyfriend Tommy LeBlanc, but fails to return home. The following morning, Deanna's body is found behind a senior housing complex, and she has been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. According to Tommy, he had walked Deanna halfway to her house before turning around and heading back home, and denies any involvement in her murder. While Tommy and two other individuals are looked at as persons of interest, no one is ever charged with the crime. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering two separate cold cases: the 1995 murder of Deanna Cremin and the 1989 disappearance of Melanie Melanson. Over the past few years, I've received requests to cover both these cases, so I decided to combine them into a single episode because while the cases aren't officially connected, there are a number of similarities. Both of the victims were teenage girls who lived in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, in separate towns located less than 10 miles away from each other. In each case, the last known person to have seen the victim alive was a young male companion who would come under suspicion. And in an eerie parallel, both of these girls were victimized in close proximity to their birthdays. Deanna was murdered just 3 days after her 17th birthday, while Melanie was only 5 days shy of her 15th birthday when she went missing. What's sad is that both these cases seem like they should be solvable, but it seems like investigators have lacked that one crucial piece of evidence to bring the perpetrator or perpetrators to justice. Anyway, I'm going to start off by exploring Deanna's murder and offering my theories and analysis about the case, and then I'll move on to Melanie's disappearance. But before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off with the unsolved murder of Deanna Cremin. Our first story begins in 1995 in Somerville, Massachusetts, a town of around 75,000 people located in Middlesex County, just a couple of miles northwest of Boston. Our central figure is Deanna Cremin, who lives with her family on Jock Street in the Winter Hill neighborhood. Deanna was originally born in Somerville, but after her parents divorced, her mother Catherine moved both her and her older sister Christine to California, where Catherine married her new husband, Michael Cremin. Catherine and Michael would have two sons, Albert and Mark, before the family eventually moved back to Somerville. On March 26th, Deanna reached her 17th birthday. At this point, Deanna is a junior at Somerville High School and holds a job as a clerk at the local Star Market. She also does volunteer work at Somerville Cable Access Television and works with students in the Childhood Development Program at her school. While Deanna isn't quite sure yet what she wants to do with her life, most people suspect that it will involve working with children, as she is considered to be the neighborhood's favorite babysitter and is just a well-liked person in general. On Wednesday, March 29th, Deanna completed a class assignment in which she listed 5 goals: graduating high school, finding an enjoyable job, purchasing a dark green Mustang convertible, having a happy family, and in an eerie coincidence, her 5th goal, which she considered to be her most important, was, quote, to live long and healthy. After school ended, Deanna wound up bumping into her mother Catherine on the bus. Catherine was on her way home from work, and Deanna told her that she was heading to her 19-year-old boyfriend Tommy LeBlanc's house in order to study and do her homework. A few hours later, Deanna phoned her mother to say that she was not going to be home in time for her 10 p.m. curfew, but said she would leave after she finished watching television with Tommy. They both said "I love you" to each other before ending their call, but this would turn out to be the last time they ever spoke. Catherine soon fell asleep on the couch and woke up at around midnight, but was surprised to discover that Deanna was not home yet. Deanna was carrying around a pager which her mother had given for her on her 17th birthday, but even after Catherine phoned the pager multiple times, there was no response. Catherine assumed that Deanna was probably staying overnight at Tommy's house, but by the time morning hit on March 30th, she had still not returned, so Catherine phoned Tommy to ask where Deanna was. Tommy's house was located about a half-mile away on Broadway, and Tommy claimed that he had left with Deanna the previous night to walk her home. However, they only made it to the halfway point at the intersection of Heath and Bond Street before they went their separate ways, as Tommy said he was expecting an order of takeout food back at his place. He didn't seem to have any idea what happened to Deanna after they went their separate ways. This caused Catherine to become extremely concerned, but she had to leave for work, so she asked her husband Michael to call Deanna's school to see if she was there and keep her posted about Deanna's whereabouts. But unfortunately, it wouldn't be long before Michael called Catherine and told her to come home because he had some horrible news. At around 8 a.m. that morning, 2 girls whom Deanna had babysat for were on their way to school and decided to take a shortcut behind a senior housing complex on Jock Street, located less than a block away from Deanna's home. They wound up stumbling upon Deanna's body. She was partially undressed, and it turned out that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The crime absolutely devastated the community, since Deanna was such a well-liked person, and over 1,000 mourners attended Deanna's funeral. The police soon released a composite sketch for an unidentified man who had been seen near the senior housing complex on the night Deanna was killed. He was described as being between 40 to 45 years old, between 5'9" and 5'11", and between 160 and 170 pounds. They stated the man wasn't a suspect, but they wanted to question him in case he saw or heard anything. However, the brunt of the suspicion would be directed towards Tommy LeBlanc, the last known person to have seen Deanna alive. Right from the outset, Catherine was suspicious of Tommy's story that he walked Deanna halfway home before they went their separate ways. Whenever Deanna visited Tommy's house, it was common practice for him to walk Deanna right to her front door and wait for her to go inside. He would subsequently call Deanna after he arrived back home, but he made no attempt to call the Cremin household on that night. The location where Tommy claimed he parted ways with Deanna was only about 475 feet from where her body was ultimately found. Deanna and Tommy seemed like an unlikely couple, since she was very personable and outgoing, while he was quiet and withdrawn. Catherine would later uncover dozens of letters Tommy had written to Deanna, which gave her the impression that he had an unhealthy obsession with her daughter. Just 2 months after the murder, Tommy's mother, Susan LeBlanc, actually took out a restraining order on her son. Susan's lawyer would state that this decision was not related to Deanna's case, but that Tommy had become prone to mood swings following the murder and threatened his mother. While Tommy had not physically harmed Susan, she had become uncomfortable being in the same house with him because of his bad temper, and she wanted him to get the help he needed. Tommy was also reportedly uncooperative with the investigation into Deanna's murder, refusing to take a polygraph, and electing to plead the Fifth Amendment when called upon to testify in front of a grand jury. He was named as a person of interest, and eventually moved to northern Massachusetts to live with his uncle. According to Catherine, Tommy never came to any of the memorial masses for Deanna, and she has not seen or heard from him since 1997. The Cremin family has never been shy about publicly expressing their suspicions about Tommy, and Deanna's sister, Christine, was once quoted as saying, I don't believe that he's innocent. But in addition to Tommy, there were also 2 other persons of interest, though neither of them has been named publicly. One of them was a fireman from the Somerville Fire Department. The fire station was located on Broadway, not far from Deanna's house, and Deanna would often see this man when she walked past the station on the way home from school. Even though he was more than twice Deanna's age, he was allegedly flirtatious and seemed to have a fixation on her. There's not much information out there about this fireman, though an article published in the Boston Globe shortly after the murder stated that he was from, quote, one of the city's most politically influential families. The third person of interest was a man who was currently serving time at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Cedar Junction for an unrelated rape. This man was questioned, and even though he denied killing Deanna, he apparently had no qualms explaining what he would have done if he had carried out the crime. But other than that, there's very little information about him. Anyway, the murder of her daughter destroyed Deanna Cremin and sent her on a complete downward spiral. She lost her job, divorced her husband, had her house foreclosed on, and abused drugs and alcohol. Catherine wound up being arrested for drunk driving after getting into a car accident, and even though she only received probation for the incident, she temporarily lost custody of her other children. Catherine has described the rest of 1995 as a big blur, but she did finally clean herself up, got her kids back, and eventually became a grandmother. But sadly, Catherine would later experience another horrible tragedy when her daughter Christine, who became a mother figure for her younger siblings following Deanna's murder, wound up passing away in 2017 at the age of 40. Deanna's stepfather, Michael, was also left completely broken by the ordeal, and he died in 2008 at the age of 58. In spite of her many tragedies, Catherine has continued to remain an advocate for Deanna and kept the case in the spotlight. The community has gone out of their way to honor Deanna's memory. In the summer of 1995, a square located near her home, at the corner of Temple and Jock Street, was dedicated to her and named Deanna Cremin Square. Many years later, a local playground was renovated and renamed the Deanna Cremin Playground. An annual Deanna Cremin Reward Scholarship was implemented, and each year, $500 is given to one recipient from the Childhood Development Program at Somerville High School. In 1999, singer Willie Alexander, formerly of the band The Velvet Underground, decided to write and release a song about the tragedy titled Who Killed Deanna? In 2005, the Middlesex District Attorney announced that forensic evidence was going to be retested with procedures which were unavailable 10 years earlier, but unfortunately, this has not led the case any closer to a resolution. According to Catherine, 4 different Middlesex District Attorneys have passed through the office since Deanna's murder, and each one of them has told her that an arrest was imminent, but this has never come to fruition. In 2013, Deanna's friends and family held a rally in which they stood in silence in front of Tommy LeBlanc's former home on Broadway, wearing t-shirts which read, "Walk Deanna Home." Catherine then proceeded to lead the group to her family's former home on Jock Street, taking the exact route her daughter would have taken as they chanted, "Who Killed Deanna?" Over the years, the initial $10,000 reward for information has increased multiple times and currently sits at $70,000. New billboards are frequently erected which offer this reward, and it always features the quote, "You know what you did to me. How much longer must I wait? Please help make my time in heaven restful." But unfortunately, after nearly 25 years, the murder of Deanna Cremin continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Anyway, out of all the crimes I've covered on this podcast, Deanna Cremin's murder seems to have had one of the most traumatic impacts on the victim's loved ones and the community where it took place. I've already mentioned how Deanna's murder caused her mother to go into a downward spiral and hit rock bottom, and if that wasn't enough, she recently had to go through the ordeal of losing another daughter. Even after all these years, Somerville is still paying tribute to Deanna's memory by naming locations like playgrounds after her, which should give you an idea about what a special person she was in the community. Somerville is considered to be a very blue-collar town, and the Cremins lived in the Winter Hill neighborhood. If that name sounds familiar, that's because the neighborhood used to be the home base of a number of infamous organized crime figures who formed the Winter Hill Gang, which was once led by the notorious James Whitey Bulger. In fact, Deanna's murder actually took place only a few months after Bulger went into hiding after becoming a wanted fugitive, so the Winter Hill Gang was pretty much on its last legs. But 1995 was a pretty devastating year for Somerville, because less than 3 months after Deanna was killed, another horrific crime took place in the adjacent Prospect Hill neighborhood. Janet Downing, a 42-year-old single mother of 4, was fatally stabbed in her home 98 times, and the killer was soon identified as 15-year-old Edward O'Brien Jr., the best friend of one of her sons, and whose grandfather happened to be the former Somerville police chief. In spite of the perpetrator's young age, he was tried as an adult, convicted of first-degree murder, and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But as you can imagine, there's been a lot of frustration in the community that this particular crime got solved quickly, while Deanna's murder is still unsolved all these years later, even though a number of people believe they have a pretty good idea what happened. Deanna Cremin has never been hesitant to express her frustration because the Middlesex District Attorney's Office have constantly put her through a non-stop cycle where they'll raise her hopes about an arrest being made, but then nothing happens. In March of this past year, the current Middlesex District Attorney announced that a new cold case unit had been launched, and there was hope that Deanna's case would be one of their top priorities. But Catherine responded by saying, quote, "Of course, I'm trying to remain hopeful that this new cold case unit can finally solve Deanna's murder, but I've been let down so many times over the past 24 years that anything less than an arrest or a conviction just isn't enough." End quote. Now, if you do any online searches about this case, you'll come across unsubstantiated allegations in forums and comment sections that the higher-ups in Somerville have been using stalling tactics and stifling the investigation in order to protect the killer, who was connected to some powerful people. Of course, these are nothing more than internet rumors, so I can't vouch for the validity of any of these claims, but given that the crime does seem to be solvable, I know why it would be tempting to believe that some sort of cover-up has taken place. All we do know is that 3 individuals have been looked at as persons of interest. Deanna's boyfriend, Tommy LeBlanc, the last known person to see her alive, an unnamed firefighter who allegedly had an interest in Deanna, and an unnamed inmate currently serving time in prison for rape. Of course, Deanna's family has made no secret about the fact that they consider Tommy to be the most likely suspect, and it's not hard to see why. Tommy's story was that he was walking Deanna home on the night she was killed, but they only reached the approximate halfway point on the route before Tommy said goodbye to her and then turned around and headed back home. It sounds like this was very uncharacteristic of Tommy, since he would normally walk Deanna all the way to her front door and then call her once he returned to his own place, but on this particular night, he never phoned the Cremin residence, and Catherine had to phone him the following morning to tell him Deanna never arrived. If Tommy is telling the truth, then it's such an unlucky coincidence that on the one night he decided not to walk Deanna the entire route home, she wound up being attacked and murdered by an unknown perpetrator. Tommy's reasoning for his decision is that he needed to return home because he was expecting an order of takeout food. Even though I have not seen this piece of information confirmed by an official source, I found an old post Catherine wrote online many years ago in which she claimed that Tommy produced a receipt that showed that he did have food delivered to his house that night. But if Tommy was guilty, then this may have been his way of fabricating an alibi for himself. After he murdered Deanna, Tommy could have returned home and immediately ordered some food, as the receipt could have been evidence to show that he was at his house during the approximate time period Deanna was killed. But the problem is that we don't actually know the exact time Deanna's murder took place, as her body wasn't found until 8 a.m. the following morning. So even if Tommy did order food at some point that night, this doesn't exactly give him an airtight alibi, which proves he could not have committed the crime. It doesn't sound like investigators have conclusively established whether or not Deanna was murdered at the location she was found, so theoretically, if Tommy was responsible, he could have killed her elsewhere and dumped her body there. Of course, the big question is what could have been the motive? Well, from everything I've read about them, Deanna and Tommy seem to be polar opposites in every way, as she was very vibrant and outgoing, whereas Tommy was quiet and withdrawn, and I don't get the impression that her friends and family were too fond of him. I haven't heard of any specific problems they may have been having in their relationship at that time, But it sounds like Tommy was pretty obsessive and insecure, so if Deanna attempted to break up with him, this could have caused him to snap and go into a violent rage. Deanna's family have even acknowledged that they believe the murder may have been a crime of passion and that Tommy didn't plan on killing her, but he just lost all control when he wrapped his hands around her neck and wound up strangling her to death. The fact that Tommy's own mother wound up taking out a restraining order on him only 2 months after the murder because she was concerned about his potentially violent temper is also troubling, and you have to wonder if he said or did something which made her suspect he killed Deanna. But it must be reiterated that the evidence against Tommy has never been considered strong enough for police to formally name him as a suspect, only a person of interest. And we also have 2 other persons of interest, though the details about them are so vague that it's really hard to say much about them. Of course, there's the firefighter from the Somerville Police Department, who supposedly had a fixation with Deanna, even though he was twice her age. The fire station where he worked at that time is located on Broadway and was only about a 6 to 7 minute walk from Deanna's place. I have no idea how thoroughly this fireman was investigated, or if he had an alibi on the night of the crime, but I guess it's not completely out of the question that he could have been in the area at the time Deanna was killed. I mentioned earlier that a Boston Globe article said this guy was from, quote-unquote, one of the city's most politically influential families, so I wonder if this has fueled some of the gossip I've read online about people in power intentionally stalling the investigation. Without more information about this man, I can't determine the likelihood of him being the perpetrator. And then there's the third person of interest, the inmate currently serving time for rape in Cedar Junction, who apparently described how he would have personally murdered Deanna, even though he denied actually being responsible. So yes, that's definitely a major red flag. I'm not exactly sure how they connected this man to Deanna, but I have read a comment on Reddit from a poster named AOLL who wrote, quote, "The suspect incarcerated at Cedar Junction is a former employee from the Star Market where Deanna worked. Both he and Tommy LeBlanc bear a striking resemblance to the sketch of the man observed near the crime scene." End quote. As you recall, police did release a composite sketch of this unidentified man shortly after the murder, but I don't quite see how he resembles Tommy, since he was described as being between 40 and 45 years old. But it is interesting to hear that he apparently has a resemblance to the inmate. However, police said they did not consider this unidentified man to be a suspect and only wanted to question him, so for all we know, he could have just been an innocent bystander passing through the area who had no idea that a girl was murdered there and never found out the police were looking for him. I know the odds are not high that a random predator would attack Deanna after she parted ways with Tommy during her walk home, but it sounds like these other 2 persons of interest were acquainted with Deanna and may have known where she lived, so I guess it's not impossible that they could have crossed paths with her. However, there's one additional reason to believe that the most likely perpetrator is Tommy. As you recall, back in 2005, the Middlesex District Attorney announced that some of the physical evidence was going to be retested because of the advances in forensic technology, which they hope would increase their chances of closing the case. They have since reiterated this point multiple times, yet here we are 14 years later, and an arrest has still not been made. Investigators have never provided any specific details about what type of forensic testing they were doing or what the results might have been, but since Deanna was sexually assaulted, you'd assume this likely involved DNA evidence. If they found DNA which matched the other 2 persons of interest in this case, that would be really hard for them to explain. But if they found DNA matching Tommy, the issue is that he was her boyfriend at the time, so he could potentially use the explanation that he had consensual sex with Deanna earlier that night before she was subsequently murdered by an unknown third party. So it's possible the authorities believe that a DNA match to Tommy is not strong enough evidence to make an arrest. Now, I don't have an official secondary source to corroborate this, but a few years ago, Deanna Cremin wrote a letter to the Somerville News Weekly in which she stated that the only piece of forensic evidence which pointed to an outside attacker was a single hair of unknown origin. But it would have been easy for Deanna to innocently pick up one random hair somewhere, so it might not mean anything to the case, and Catherine believes that an attacker would have left a lot more physical evidence behind. To be clear, The authorities have never publicly confirmed this information about the hair, so we only have Catherine's word about it, but if true, she does make a valid point. Catherine also claimed that Tommy left town and she has not seen him since 1997. He has refused to speak to the media, and I have no idea if he has ever been re-interviewed by police or had his DNA collected. Since investigators have withheld a lot of information from the public these past several years, all my talk about DNA and physical evidence is nothing more than pure speculation. Regardless, I know that Deanna's family have always believed that Tommy LeBlanc was the guilty party, and from all the facts I've seen, he does seem to be the most likely suspect. In this case, the simplest explanation might be the correct one, as something may have happened between Tommy and Deanna that night which caused him to go into a violent rage and sexually assault her before strangling her to death. I hope that all the rumors and gossip I've read online about cover-ups and stalling the investigation are not true, and that the people in power aren't trying to protect the killer. This may be a case where the authorities know who did it, but just lack the smoking gun to make an arrest and compel the district attorney's office to file charges. I can understand the reasoning, but I'm sure that provides no comfort for Deanna's family, who have been through pure hell for nearly 25 years and are desperate for a resolution. This case does sound like it should be solvable, so if you happen to have any information on the murder of Deanna Cremin, please contact the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office at 617-679-6600. That's 617-679-6600. Or you can contact the Somerville Police Department at 617-625-1600. That's 617-625-1600. So now let's move on and start exploring the disappearance of Melanie Melanson. Our second story begins in 1989 in Woburn, Massachusetts, a town which is also located in Middlesex County, about 10 miles northwest of Somerville. Our central figure this time around is 14-year-old Melanie Melanson, who is a freshman at Woburn High School, but has experienced a troubled home life. Melanie's parents, John and Irene Melanson, have both dealt with substance abuse issues and are constantly fighting, which has compelled Melanie to run away from home on at least one occasion. Thankfully, Melanie has been able to rely on the support of her aunts and maternal grandmother whenever things have gotten rough. At this particular point, she is living with her grandmother, who is nicknamed Big Irene, though she still maintains contact with her parents. On Friday, October the 27th, Melanie was just 5 days shy of her 15th birthday. After she arrived home from school, Melanie told her grandmother that she was planning to spend the night with her friend Lori, who lived next door. In actuality, Melanie had been invited to a party that night, and the sleepover was just a cover story. The party would be held in a wooded area near an industrial park on the outskirts of town. The area was known for being a popular hangout for partying and underage drinking, and located about a mile from Melanie's house. Since she had a curfew, Melanie's friend Lori would not be able to attend the party with her, but Melanie was still planning to return to Lori's house afterward and spend the night. However, Melanie did not arrive that night, and the following afternoon, her grandmother finally learned that she did not actually stay over at Lori's house and attended a party instead. Big Irene started contacting Melanie's friends to find out more information about the party. She learned that about a dozen people attended, and Melanie was the youngest person there, but no one seemed to know where she was. This prompted Melanie's family to contact the Woburn Police Department and report her missing. Unfortunately, since Melanie had run away from home in the past, the police initially assumed that she might have done so again and possibly run away to Florida. Of course, her family did not believe this, since Melanie left all of her personal belongings at home, and on the previous occasions she had run away, Melanie did contact her family to let them know she was okay. In spite of her ongoing issues with her parents, Melanie seemed to be in good spirits at this time, as she was looking forward to her 15th birthday, and her father was planning to take her shopping for a new leather jacket as a present. Melanie was also excited about getting her braces off in a few weeks, as well as an upcoming transfer to a new high school. The police did eventually conclude that Melanie did not disappear of her own volition, and started interviewing the other dozen people who were at the party. They all said that as the night wore on, they each went home, and to the last 3 people left were Melanie and 2 older boys, 16-year-old Eugene Bertini, who went by the name Gene, and 18-year-old James Tresca, who went by Jimmy. Gene and Jimmy were each interviewed separately, and at first, they gave conflicting stories where they accused the other of being the last person to see Melanie. They finally did settle on a story in which Gene and Melanie were left alone together. According to Jimmy, he headed home at around 2 a.m. and offered Melanie a ride, but she told him that she wanted to stay behind for a little while to hang out with Gene. Gene then claimed that he soon left the woods with Melanie, and they both walked down a trail to a nearby street where his motorcycle was parked. However, because he only brought one helmet along with him, Gene said he could not offer Melanie a ride. He subsequently rode off, while Melanie walked away in the other direction, but he maintained that he had no idea what happened to her afterward. Well, needless to say, there was some skepticism about this story, particularly since Gene last placed Melanie walking in the opposite direction of her friend's house. It would also turn out that in the week following Melanie's disappearance, Jimmy's car suddenly went missing, and he would claim that it was stolen. In addition, rumors started circulating that Jimmy had been seen with a dirty shovel. Gene and Jimmy had girlfriends at this time, but they both refused to speak with investigators, and there was gossip around town that Gene had been cheating on his girlfriend with Melanie. Over the past 3 decades, law enforcement has conducted several searches of the wooded area where the party occurred, and a number of excavations and digs have taken place. In addition, at least one search has been performed on property which is believed to be associated with an individual in this case. There have also been quite a few anonymous tips. In 1992, an anonymous caller contacted the police and suggested they search a pond located near this area, but they failed to turn up anything. In 2012, investigators received an anonymous call from a man who claimed he was a former friend of one of the people who attended the party. He said that one of the attendees had been seen at Middlesex Falls Reservation in the nearby town of Stoneham. During a search of this location, a cadaver dog thought they detected the scent of human remains, but in the end, nothing was found. In April of 2011, Gene Bertini found himself in legal trouble when he and his wife were both arrested for committing an armed robbery at a gas station in the town of Wakefield. Gene entered the establishment and robbed the employee of $300 before pistol whipping him. The employee's teenage brother happened to be there at the time, and Gene wound up pistol whipping him as well before stealing his necklace. Following his arrest, Gene would be asked to submit to DNA testing, but adamantly refused. A Superior Court judge ultimately ordered Gene to provide his DNA, but only for usage in the armed robbery case. Anyway, both of Melanie's parents, as well as her grandmother, Big Irene, have since passed away, but she has numerous aunts and uncles who are still advocating for her in order to keep her case in the spotlight. While no one has ever officially been named as a suspect or person of interest, police believe that Melanie was a victim of foul play and that her body may have been moved from the original location where she was buried. Michael Pandolf, one of the detectives on the case, has openly discounted the possibility that Melanie was abducted and believes her disappearance was caused by something that happened at the party. He stated, quote, "I'm 99.99% certain that a stranger didn't come into these woods and pluck her out of there. She didn't get snatched by some stranger. I know some people who have spun that tale. People at that party know exactly what happened." End quote. But unfortunately, after nearly 30 years, Melanie has still never been found. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is definitely a troubling and frustrating case on a number of levels. We have a teenage girl who sneaks out for a late-night party involving underage drinking, and being only a few days shy of her 15th birthday, she was definitely the youngest person there. And the consensus seems to be that Melanie was eventually left alone there with 2 older guys, and there's good reason to be suspicious of both of them. This case is very reminiscent of the episode I did a few months ago about the disappearance of 15-year-old Marie Blee, who also went missing after attending a party. Much like with Melanie, numerous witnesses placed Marie in the company of a couple of older guys before she disappeared, and at least 2 of them would go on to have troubles with the law when they got older. I already mentioned that Gene Bertini wound up getting arrested for armed robbery over 21 years later, but if you do a Google search on James Tresca, you'll see that he also seems to have a history of run-ins with the law, including a 2009 arrest in Lowell for domestic assault and battery, malicious destruction of property over $250, and intimidating a witness. So yeah, we're not exactly talking about model citizens here, and it does not bode well that Melanie was alone with these 2 guys before she vanished. And look at the story they provided. According to Gene, he was prepared to give Melanie a ride back to her friend's house on his motorcycle, but then he realized that he had only brought along 1 helmet with him. So he rode off and left Melanie behind, and that's the last time he ever saw her. Are you kidding me? Let me get this straight. This guy is such an advocate for motorcycle safety that he won't let Melanie ride with him without a helmet, yet he's got no qualms about stranding a 14-year-old girl alone on the outskirts of town without a ride at 2 a.m.? Not to mention that he claims he last saw Melanie walking in the opposite direction of her friend's house, so nothing about his story makes sense. You can see the parallels with the Deanna Cremin case. In order to believe that the last person who saw them alive is innocent, you have to accept the idea that shortly after they parted ways, the victim was subsequently murdered by an unknown third party. While that possibility was difficult enough to swallow in Deanna's murder, the investigators in Melanie's case have flat out stated that they are 99.99% certain she was not abducted by a stranger and that something happened to her at that party. Unfortunately, this is yet another missing persons case involving a teenager in which the investigation was hampered by the police's initial assumption that the victim ran away. To be fair, Melanie had already run away from home before on at least one occasion, since it does not sound like she had the easiest childhood. But it bothers me when they jump to that conclusion after the victim has left all their personal belongings behind at home. And I've always been confused by the police's initial assumption that Melanie ran away to Florida. I don't know if there's a specific reason why they thought she was heading to Florida, but what made them so certain that a teenage girl was going to travel over 1,000 miles there with nothing more than the clothes on her back? But to their credit, once the Woburn Police Department finally started taking Melanie's disappearance seriously, it sounds like there has been no shortage of attempts to find her, as they have performed a number of searches and excavations of various locations these past 3 decades. Whenever they receive a tip about where Melanie's remains might be buried, they always make sure they act on it. It seems like investigators believe that Melanie has been moved at least once, as it's possible she was initially buried in the wooded area where the party took place, before her remains were dug up and transported to another location at a later time. I know that an anonymous caller led police towards the Middlesex Falls Reservation, a public recreation area which covers around 2,200 acres, which is a lot of ground to cover to search for Melanie. Without a body, it sounds like it would be pretty difficult to make a case against anyone, but another obstacle is that we have 2 potential suspects in this case, and it might be hard to determine who conclusively did what. During their initial questioning, it seems like Gene and Jimmy both said that the other was the last person to see Melanie, until Gene finally admitted that he rode off on his bicycle without her and left her behind. While Jimmy claims that he drove home and left Gene and Melanie in the woods alone, it does seem pretty likely that they both have some sort of involvement, particularly since Jimmy's car conveniently went missing a few days later after it was quote-unquote stolen. Now, I've only seen this next piece of information shared on message boards like WebSleuths, and it has not been corroborated by any official media source, so you need to take it with a grain of salt, but it is worth mentioning. From what I've read, Jimmy's stepfather was an officer with the Woburn Police Department at that time, but shortly after Melanie went missing, he retired and moved down to Florida with his family. I don't know how true that is, but the part about Jimmy living in Florida does check out, since an online search has turned up some arrest records for him down there in the 1990s and early 2000s. And it would make sense to me if Jimmy and Gene had assistants covering up their crime, as we're talking about a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old here, and it seems pretty sophisticated of them to come up with the idea of potentially moving Melanie's body to another location and making Jimmy's car disappear to cover up potential forensic evidence. If Jimmy's police officer stepfather learned about what happened, he would have known the best steps to take to cover up the crime and had enough inside knowledge to stay one step ahead of the investigation. Again, I don't know the veracity of these rumors involving the stepfather, but I do not find them unbelievable. It's also interesting how Gene fought against having his DNA taken when he was arrested for armed robbery in 2011, and even filed an appeal with the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. This reads like he was paranoid about the ramifications of having his DNA on file if DNA evidence related to Melanie's case ever turned up someday. It's also possible that Gene and Jimmy might not be the only people from the party who have answers about what happened to Melanie. Even if the other attendees were not directly involved, some of them might still know more than they've let on. I know that Gene and Jimmy's girlfriends at that time apparently refused to speak with police and did not cooperate with the investigation. It's not entirely clear if the girlfriends were actually present at the party that night, but I know there were rumors that Gene was cheating on his girlfriend with Melanie, which would explain why she was invited to hang out and drink with a group of older kids. The one part of this story which does seem consistent and was corroborated by multiple witnesses is that Jimmy, Gene, and Melanie were the last 3 people there, and unfortunately, I can think of many ways this situation could have gone horribly wrong. I'm not sure if this was premeditated murder, or if Melanie was killed when things escalated out of control, but it seems obvious that something happened, and at the very least, Jimmy and Gene were complicit. While it's possible that no one else was present, there may be others with knowledge of what took place. Sadly, I've seen far too many cold cases in which teenagers have gone missing or wound up dead following a party, and it seemed apparent that multiple people knew the truth, but kept it a secret. Over the years, police have received a number of anonymous tips, which compelled them to perform a new search, so you get the impression that there are people out there who are anxious to talk, but may be unwilling or too afraid to come forward and reveal everything. Investigators are convinced that Melanie is buried somewhere in Middlesex County, likely in an area near Woburn and Stoneham, but it sounds like they just need the right person to come forward with the right tip. While Melanie has lost a number of family members, she still has relatives and friends who are advocating for her and deserve closure since they have been without answers for nearly 30 years. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Melanie Melanson, please contact the Woburn Police Department at 781-933-1212. That's 781-933-1212. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past year, we've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this month, we've released a new episode about the unsolved murder of David Buller, a Canadian cold case from Toronto, which I covered during my live show at the True Crime Podcast Festival in Chicago last month. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also released another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Babette H, Megan T, Lindsay L, and Emma B. Thank you all so much for your support. Of course, on August the 18th, just a few weeks from now, I will be participating in another true crime podcasting event at the Royal Cinema in Toronto, which will also include Christy from Canadian True Crime, Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, Nina from Already Gone, and Aaron from Generation Y. At the event, we will be doing a presentation about the Donnellys, an infamous Canadian true crime case from the 19th century, and the show will also include panel discussions, an interactive Q&A, and a meet and greet. Tickets are $25 each, and you can find the link to our website to purchase them in our episode description. And the weekend after that, I will also be doing another live show at the Ottawa Podcast Festival, being held in my hometown of Ottawa, Ontario on Saturday, August the 24th. The festival is an all-day event featuring live shows from a whole bunch of different local podcasts, and the Trail Went Cold will do a 1-hour show at 7:30 p.m. that evening. To learn more information or to purchase tickets to the event, please visit their website at ottawapodcastfestival.com. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another new episode of The Trail Went Cold.